Before Rome rose as an empire dominating lands and seas, before its aqueducts spanned valleys, and its legions marched across the entire Mediterranean basin, it was merely a modest village on the banks of the Tiber River. Even in those early days, in the slow transition from monarchy to the first outlines of a republic, the seeds were already being sown for a system that would define the structural foundation of its economy for centuries to come: slavery. Roman slavery did not arise immediately from conquest or as an external imposition. It was above all a reflection of archaic values that equated defeat and submission with the loss of freedom. In a world where war was constant and strength dictated the fate of men, becoming a slave was the common destiny of the vanquished. The earliest records of slavery in Rome date back to the monarchical period, still in the centuries preceding the 6th century before Christ, when the Etruscan kings dominated the political landscape of the city. Slaves were obtained not only through military conflicts, but also through debt, a practice that would persist until the social struggles of the Republic. A citizen who failed to meet his financial obligations could legally become the servant of his creditor, often being forced to work in their home or lands until the debt was settled. These early servants, known as nexi, were not exactly slaves in the full sense of the word, but they lived under harsh conditions of servitude and had their freedom suspended. As Rome grew in power and population, so did the complexity of its society, and with it, the need for labor. The small family farms that supported Latin peasants began to coexist with larger estates, where forced labor was beginning to take root. However, the true explosion of slavery would come with the advent of the Republic and the consolidation of military expansionism. Successive victories on the battlefield brought not only territories, but also prisoners, and these prisoners were immediately transformed into property. The Romans developed a pragmatic and brutal mentality regarding slavery. For them, freedom was a privilege of the freeborn and of citizens. The defeated foreigner, the captured barbarian, or even the indebted Roman did not enjoy the same moral or legal status. The concept of dignity was deeply tied to libertas, and thus the slave was seen as something akin to a human tool. This view, embedded in the core of institutions and customs, allowed slavery to be not only accepted, but glorified in many circles. In the earliest Roman literary sources, such as in a Titus Livius, we observe that slavery was such a natural part of daily life that it was not even morally questioned. Slaves served in homes, tended the fields, accompanied their masters in wars, and were often entrusted with administrative responsibilities. As early as the first centuries of the Republic, the figure of the slave was so deeply rooted in the fabric of the city that Rome seemed unable to function without them. The political body was composed of free citizens, but the economic engine moved through the invisible hands of thousands of men and women reduced to property. It is also important to note that slavery in Rome was a fluid institution. There was no single origin or function for the enslaved. One could be a defeated warrior, an abandoned child sold by a merchant, or a criminal sentenced to servitude. This variety of origins gave the servile class an impressive ethnic and cultural diversity. Greeks, Thracians, Iberians, Syrians, Egyptians, Nubians, all were at some point absorbed into the machinery of Roman slavery, and each new conquest, each new province annexed to the rising empire, fed this engine with more and more human lives. This early structure laid the foundation for what would later become one of the largest slave societies in ancient history, a society where a man's value was measured in denarii, where birth, skin color, or native language determined whether one would live in freedom or in chains. But for the Romans of the early Republic, slavery was less a moral tragedy and more a functional necessity, and it is this impassive, almost mechanical acceptance of slave labor as the foundation of economy and order that reveals, with brutal clarity, the spirit of a rising Rome. In the next phases of Roman history, we will see how this practice expanded exponentially, shaping not only the economy of the countryside and cities, but also the culture, politics, religion, and even the very idea of empire. Slavery was not merely an institution of Rome, it was the invisible mortar that held together its temples, theaters, and armies. And, as we will see, every stone raised, every road paved, every abundant harvest carries silently the mark of a slave who never had the right to be remembered by name. As Rome ceased to be a regional power and became a key player in the wars for hegemony over the Mediterranean, the machinery of slavery assumed colossal proportions. What had begun as a sporadic practice became an institutionalized system, fueled not only by debt or birth, but above all by the greatest driving force of Roman expansion: war. In every conquered territory, in every besieged city, in every subdued people, a new contingent of human bodies emerged, destined for the slave markets. And it was this silent multitude, defeated in the shadows of Roman triumphs, that became the invisible backbone of the empire's economy. The logic was simple and merciless. To conquer meant to seize everything from the enemy: land, riches, and people. Those who were not killed were imprisoned, and the prisoners were sold. Since the 4th century before Christ, with the expansion across the Italian peninsula, Roman generals had already been bringing thousands of prisoners home. But it was after the Punic Wars, especially at the end of the 3rd century before Christ, that Rome's slave-driving machine reached a new scale. The victory over Carthage not only secured maritime and territorial supremacy, but also opened the gates to the systematic mass capture of slaves, particularly in Sicily, Hispania, and Greece. The Macedonian Wars, fought between the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, brought thousands of Greek captives to Rome, among them philosophers, architects, teachers, doctors, poets. Contrary to what one might assume, these cultured and civilized men were also turned into commodities, not for the mines or the fields, but to serve as symbols of prestige in the mansions of senatorial families. Thus, Rome not only conquered lands and cultures, but absorbed them through servitude, shaping them to its liking, controlling their knowledge, and reaping their benefits. The war slave, therefore, was not just a body to be exploited, but an intellectual asset, a living tool. In the accounts of Tiasma Polybius and Maisaun Livy, we observe how the spoils of military campaigns included countless prisoners. On many occasions, their numbers were so great that slave prices collapsed in local markets. A famous example occurred after the capture of Syracuse, when thousands of inhabitants were taken as captives and sold en masse. The profits from these transactions went directly to the generals, officers, and not infrequently to the soldiers themselves, who received a share of the spoils. War, therefore, was not merely an exercise in power and glory, it was an industry, and slaves were its most valuable currency. The process of capture, however, was brutal. Cities that resisted to the end faced exemplary punishments. Men were slaughtered, women and children enslaved, and the survivors marched in chains over long distances to ports, where they were loaded and transported like cargo. Many died before even reaching their final destination. Those who survived underwent a ritual of dehumanization. They received brands, generic names, and were classified according to their strength, age, and usefulness. A young, strong Thracian could be sold as a gladiator. A beautiful and educated Greek woman might become a tutor for noble children. An elderly Numidian would be relegated to the most humiliating tasks on a rural estate. The growth of the empire and its military advances created a self-sustaining economic feedback loop. The more Rome conquered, the more slaves it acquired. The more slaves it had, the more it could expand its agriculture, its mining, and its civil construction. And the more its economy grew, the more money and power were available to fund new wars. It was a closed cycle of domination and production based on human exploitation. And the Roman state, fully aware of this, encouraged the model, rewarding its generals and allowing war profits to be largely privatized. It was victory turned into profit, glory translated into coin, the sword turned into a plow, but wielded by captive hands. The plazas and markets of the great Roman cities were constantly supplied with these captured human beings. In Rome, at the Forum Boarium and in peripheral areas, slave fairs gathered merchants, buyers, and brokers. The newcomers were displayed like cattle. They had to walk naked, show their muscles, their voices, their knowledge, if they had any. They wore plaques around their necks listing their qualities. The constant presence of war slaves, arriving from the four corners of the known world, changed the very face of Rome. Multiple languages echoed in the streets. Foreign gods infiltrated domestic rituals, and diverse cultures coexisted, all under the rule of slavery. By the end of the 2nd century before Christ, The presence of these war slaves had become so overwhelming that it provoked not only economic changes, but also social tensions. Small free landowners, ruined by competition with estates fueled by slave labor, migrated to Rome in search of bread and assistance. An impoverished and non-productive urban mass began to form, sustained by the state through subsidized grain, while the fields were tilled by captives. Thus, the expansion of war slavery created a paradox. It enriched the elite while eroding the social foundation of the Republic. Over the centuries, this model became solidified as the hidden engine of the Roman Empire. Slavery driven by war made possible the existence of monumental cities, colossal arenas, luxurious palaces, and permanent armies. But behind every mosaic, every marble column, every abundant harvest, there was a conquered body, a wounded soul, a name erased. Roman conquest was also the institutionalization of captivity as normalcy, and the victorious soldier was inevitably the unwitting executioner of a new slave. When one imagines ancient Rome in all its opulence, it is impossible to separate that image from the constant and silent presence of domestic slaves. In the polished marbles of patrician villas, the shaded corridors of the insulae, the public baths and the private schools, the hands that served, cleaned, taught, and obeyed were, for the most part, those of men and women who did not own their own destinies. Urban slavery, distinct from the harshness of the mines or the brutality of the countryside, represented a subtler and more complex layer of Roman society, where control was exercised not only by force, but also through constant surveillance, proximity, and the illusion of participation in a world that would never belong to them. In the grand domus of the senatorial and equestrian elite, slaves formed the core of the domestic engine. They were table servants, chamberlains, cooks, gardeners, musicians, librarians, pedagogues, and secretaries. A Roman household of high status could have dozens, sometimes hundreds of slaves, organized in precise hierarchies as if they were a small state. Some were specialized, trained from youth for specific functions. Others remained on standby, ready to follow any command from the dominus, the master of the house. This organization not only reflected the family's power, but also its sophistication. The more varied and numerous the servile family, the greater the prestige of its owner. The pedagogi, for instance, were educated Greek slaves responsible for the children's education. Considered valuable, these men were often treated with a certain deference, though they remained legally as property. In many homes, matrons entrusted their children to these enslaved tutors, allowing them to shape the minds of Rome's future elite. Other urban slaves worked as scribes, accountants, and even physicians, prestigious professions that, paradoxically, could be held by people stripped of their freedom. This coexistence of functional dependency and legal contempt reveals the ambiguous nature of domestic slavery. The servants were close, sometimes even affectionate, but they never ceased to be things in the eyes of the law. The continuous presence of slaves inside the homes created a universe of mutual surveillance and latent tension. Masters feared conspiracies, poisonings, escapes. Slaves lived under the constant threat of punishment, physical abuse, or being sold to a new owner. The laws allowed masters to inflict severe penalties for acts deemed disrespectful or lazy. In extreme cases, all slaves in a household could be executed if one of them killed the master, even if the others had no involvement, as famously occurred in the case of Lucius Pedanius Secundus in the mid-1st century after Christ, when around 400 slaves were condemned to death because of their master's murder. Despite the harsh control, there were more subtle strategies of domination. Many masters encouraged rivalry among slaves, rewarded informants, offered benefits for loyalty, and granted small privileges to a chosen few. Thus, they created internal divisions that weakened solidarity among the captives. Urban slavery, though more refined than rural slavery, demanded of the slave a constant performance of obedience, emotional intelligence, and vigilance over their own feelings. A poorly spoken word, a tired gesture, a look of disdain could come at a high price. Curiously, many urban slaves fervently desired manumission, formal liberation, not to abandon their former masters, but to continue living under their protection as freedmen. This was because the ex-slave, once freed, often had no possessions, home, or support network. By remaining close to the former household, they could continue performing functions, now as a client of their former dominus, integrating themselves into the complex system of patronage that sustained Rome's social fabric. Freedom, in this context, was not synonymous with full autonomy, but a change of position within a still deeply hierarchical web. Beyond private homes, urban slaves were also present in public structures. They worked in the baths, theatres, state warehouses, auxiliary military corps, temples, and even in the imperial palace. The emperor himself had a vast network of servants, including eunuchs, stewards, architects, and cooks, all recruited from among the most skilled and trustworthy slaves. Over time, some of these individuals became influential figures, capable of interfering in administrative and political decisions. Still, a single accusation, a suspicion, or a gesture of disobedience was enough for them to be discarded like broken objects. Urban slavery reveals with cruel clarity the Roman ability to organize inequality with efficiency and an appearance of civility. It was a system where violence was subtle, control was psychological, and freedom was an unattainable reward. The domestic slave, contrary to what one might assume, did not live better than the field slave. They lived more watched, more scrutinized, more exposed to the whims of the elite, and even amid the marble and luxury, they carried in their eyes the same ancestral pain as those who had been conquered, sold, and forgotten. As we look at the ruins of ancient Roman domus, with their silent atriums, delicate mosaics, and inner gardens, we must remember that these spaces were sustained by erased lives, by stories that history did not record. The glory of Rome was written over the silence of those who cleaned the floors, poured the wine, educated the children, and died without ever having a surname. At the heart of the Roman world, where everything seemed to shine, there was an intimate and constant darkness, the silent gaze of the slave, while the marbles of urban villas gleamed under the Italian sun, far from the eyes of the aristocracy and the bustling crowds of the cities. Vast stretches of land were being cultivated by enslaved hands in brutal shifts that began before dawn and ended long after the last light of day had disappeared over the horizon. The Roman latifundia, massive agricultural estates that emerged from the 2nd century before Christ, became the backbone of food production and the rural economy of the empire. And at the center of this system, as a silent and tireless driving force, were the rural slaves. These estates, especially in southern Italy, Sicily, Hispania, and other fertile regions of the empire, produced grains, olive oil, wine, and other essential goods on a large scale. The owners of these lands, typically members of the senatorial or equestrian elite, amassed power and prestige based on agricultural productivity. But what truly ensured profit was not just the fertility of the soil, it was the systematic and massive exploitation of slave labor. Unlike urban slaves, who in rare cases had access to education or direct contact with their masters, the workers on the farms lived in conditions that more closely resembled a slow death. The daily lives of these men and women were marked by extremes: relentless labor under the scorching summer sun and the biting cold of winter, meager food, constant physical punishment, and an almost complete absence of hope for liberation. They lived in collective barracks, often chained at night to prevent escape, watched over by armed overseers and brutalized regularly. These overseers, often recruited from among former slaves, formed a cruel and resentful intermediary layer that used violence to enforce productivity and discipline. In many cases, the treatment of farm slaves was worse than that given to animals. The Roman agronomist Columella, in his treatise De Re Rustica, makes it clear that the master should treat slaves as instruments of production. While he acknowledges the importance of keeping workers alive and relatively healthy to ensure better results, his tone never escapes the logic of utility. The rural slave was, above all, an economic asset, and like any asset, they could be bought, sold, traded, or punished according to the owner's mood or convenience. The dehumanization was complete. The land was valued for what it could yield, and the slave for how much they could endure before collapsing. The productivity of these estates sustained not only the supply of Rome and other major cities, but also the army, the provinces, and exports. The link between rural slavery and political power was evident. The larger the estate, the greater the number of slaves, the more wealth accumulated, and consequently the more influence one had in the Senate, in the courts, in the decisions of the Republic, and later, the empire. This concentration of land and slaves in the hands of a few created a deep and irreversible social inequality. Free peasants, unable to compete with the large-scale output of the latifundia, abandoned their small properties and were forced to migrate to the cities, where they became dependent on public distributions of grain and entertainment. Rome grew fat with power, while its free people grew poorer. In the most remote regions, especially in Sicily and southern Italy, the concentration of slaves was so high that several revolts broke out, the most famous being that of Spartacus in the 1st century before Christ. The elites lived in constant fear, knowing they were building their wealth on fragile ground, filled with pain and fury. The latifundia, though economically efficient, were social time bombs. Every successful harvest hid the possibility of a new uprising, and every day of labor could be the spark for a rebellion. Additionally, agricultural slaves were used in other aspects of rural labor. They built irrigation canals, walls, silos, and barns. They planted, harvested, stomped grapes, pressed olives, and tended livestock. The slave's body was the engine of Roman agriculture, a silent, repetitive, disposable machine. In times of drought or plague, when production dropped, they were the first to suffer. With their rations reduced even further, punished for nature's failure, they died by the thousands without their names ever being recorded. Over the centuries, the strategic importance of these estates became so vital that many senators became more interested in their agricultural profits than in any political activity. The Republic agonized under the weight of individual ambitions, and the fortunes built on rural slavery became tools of corruption, patronage, and moral decline. The muffled cries from the plantations not only fed the city, they upheld the illusion of stability and order. Today, when archaeologists unearth amphorae of oil, fragments of tools, or buried bones in ancient agricultural villas, they find traces of a civilization that called itself refined, but built its abundance on the meticulously managed suffering of millions. The Roman countryside was not bucolic. It was a machine for grinding bodies and extracting wealth. And that machine would never have functioned without the crushed, invisible strength of the slaves, who from sunup to sundown kept the empire standing. If the fields fed the body of the Roman Empire, the mines and quarries supplied its skeleton, the iron for weapons, the lead for pipes, the marble for temples, the gold for coins, the copper for mirrors and statues, and the salt that preserved both food and bodies. Yet behind every gleam of brilliance, behind every marble monument that still glows under the Mediterranean sun, there existed a dark, subterranean, damp, and suffocating world where thousands of slaves lost their youth, their health, and their lives. It was there in the depths of the earth that the most brutal face of the Roman machinery was hidden, a system of forced labor that left no marks on polished marble, but whose scars ran deep in the bones of civilization. Roman mines, scattered across the imperial territory, from the mountains of Hispania to the deserts of Egypt, operated under a ruthless logic: extract as much as possible from the earth at the lowest possible cost in lives. In these subterranean guts, slavery reached its most extreme form. Captives were sent in droves, chained, stripped of everything, subjected to exhausting shifts in suffocating, dark, unventilated tunnels. They worked naked or in rags, breathing in dust from silica, lead, or sulfur. Their lungs blackened, their bodies raw. Many died within weeks. Those who survived became staggering shadows, marked by permanent pain. The extraction of precious metals such as gold and silver was vital to the Roman monetary economy. The state, through contracts with entrepreneurs or by direct imperial administration, heavily exploited regions like Las Medullas, is in what is now Spain, one of the largest mining complexes of the ancient world. There, thousands of slaves moved earth, carved hillsides, diverted rivers, all in the name of the wealth that would feed the public treasury and private luxury. Pliny the Elder, in describing these mines, declared that no human activity was more destructive. He himself wrote, "There one does not live. One merely survives for a brief interval between suffering and death." But the mines were not alone in this productive inferno. Roman quarries, like the famous marble quarries of Carrara in northern Italy, also employed multitudes of slaves. There the goal was to extract massive blocks of stone to adorn temples, forums, palaces, and bathhouses. The labor required superhuman strength, precision, and endurance. The captives used levers, hammers, ropes, and wooden wedges soaked in water that expanded and split the rock. The risks were enormous. Falls, crushings, lacerations. Every column raised on the Capitol or the Pantheon bore a cost measured in blood and bones. Beyond the mines and quarries, slaves were also widely used in public works. The Roman legions, renowned for their discipline, often oversaw the construction of roads, bridges, ports, aqueducts, and walls, but the hands that carried the stones, mixed the cement, and raised the pillars were almost always those of slaves. In Rome and the empire's great cities, monumental projects such as the Baths of Caracalla, the Colosseum, or the Aqua Claudia depended on entire legions of forced laborers. Rome's architectural grandeur was built on involuntary sweat. On construction fronts, slaves were treated as disposable tools. When one died, they were replaced. When one fell ill, they were cast aside until death. There was no medical care. There was no rest. The body was consumed to its limit. Productivity was the only measure of value. The finished result, the completed monument, that was what was celebrated, praised, eternalized. The pain that built it, that was ignored, forgotten, deliberately erased from the narrative. The presence of slaves in Roman infrastructure also extended to ports and arsenals. They carried loads, built ships, operated wooden cranes, cleaned sewers, repaired aqueducts, cleared tunnels. Wherever there was a need for physical strength and an absence of rights, there was the slave. The city functioned with impressive precision, but behind that efficiency lay an inhumane system. Slavery was the invisible cement of Roman structures. It upheld without being seen, built without being remembered. The empire, aware of the importance of these works, invested massively in them, and the more infrastructure was built, the more workers were consumed. The logic was circular. Rome needed aqueducts, roads, mines, ports, and palaces. For that, it needed slaves. To obtain more slaves, it needed wars and trade. To sustain the wars, it needed wealth. Wealth extracted from the very bodies that fed the system. A perfect cycle of exploitation. Today, when we walk through the grand ruins of ancient Rome and contemplate its arches, columns, forums, and monuments, we rarely hear the voice of those who built them, but it still echoes silently in the stones that sustain time. They are the voices of the forgotten, those who dug tunnels until collapse, those who dragged stones until their bones broke, those who died in the dark so that Rome might shine under the sunlight. Not all slaves in Rome were chained to plows, buried in mining tunnels, or subjected to whips on plantations. Amid the vast structure of Roman slavery, there existed a special, complex, and contradictory class, the skilled slaves, individuals endowed with abilities, technical knowledge, or intellectual training, who, despite their legal status as property, performed functions of great economic responsibility and even a certain degree of social prestige. These men and women, though still deprived of freedom, moved through the corridors of power, commerce, arts, and finance, forming a servile elite that played a crucial role in the functioning of the empire. Rome, with its immense administrative, urban, and commercial complexity, required professionals capable of managing businesses, keeping records, performing calculations, constructing buildings, teaching languages, caring for health, and even legally representing their masters. Many of these roles were held by specialized slaves, who received specific training or brought knowledge from their native lands. Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Thracians, and Africans arrived in the Eternal City carrying cultural baggage that, even under the burden of slavery, made them useful and therefore valuable in the eyes of Roman society. One of the most strategic roles was that of the slave merchant, also known as service negotiator. This slave was authorized by his master to manage businesses, open shops, represent trading partnerships, negotiate loans, and sign contracts. For this, he was given an initial sum of money called peculium, a capital that, though technically belonging to the master, was managed by the slave as if it were his own. With this amount, he could purchase goods, hire assistants, trade products, and grow the wealth of his dominus. In many cases, the success of the enterprise eventually allowed the slave to buy his freedom, but the risk was always real. All profit belonged to the master, and any loss fell entirely upon the slave manager. Another notable group was the artisan and technical slaves. Carpenters, blacksmiths, masons, potters, glassmakers, painters, and sculptors. Many were highly trained servants who lived and worked on their masters' estates or in specialized workshops, officinae. These slaves not only produced valuable goods, but also passed technical knowledge to future generations. Roman villas often had studios where mosaics, sculptures, and frescoes were created by enslaved hands, with precision and artistry. And despite the beauty of their creations, they rarely received recognition. The work was credited to the master. The artist remained invisible. In the field of medicine, surprisingly, many Roman doctors were slaves. Often from Greece, these men had been educated in traditional schools and, once enslaved, became invaluable assets. They treated illnesses, performed surgeries, assisted with childbirth, and in some cases, served high-ranking public officials. The paradox was stark. A slave could hold a senator's life in his hands, yet could not choose his own fate. Even so, enslaved doctors accumulated prestige and, in many cases, earned their freedom through honorable manumission. There were also intellectuals and artists among the slaves. Poets, playwrights, philosophers, and librarians served the cultural interests of the elite. Roman education, especially among the children of the nobility, was often entrusted to enslaved pedagogues, typically Greeks, who taught grammar, rhetoric, logic, and ethics. It was an ambiguous relationship. The teacher was a captive, the student a free citizen. Knowledge, in this context, became a tradable commodity, and the slave its medium of transmission. The presence of these skilled slaves reveals an essential truth about the Roman world. Slavery was not a uniform line of suffering, but a hierarchical structure, in which a person's value was directly tied to their usefulness. A strong slave might be sent to the mines, one with a fine voice to the theaters, one with mathematical intelligence to the accounting books. And thus Rome turned talent into an instrument of profit. Skill became a golden chain, less visible but equally restraining. Yet this relative mobility within slavery also gave rise to contradictions. Wealthy slaves, yes, they existed, were viewed with suspicion by poor free men. Freedmen who became wealthy as merchants or entrepreneurs often aroused envy and discomfort among the urban plebs. The line between freedom and servitude in such cases became blurred, and Rome, with all its social rigidity, was forced to tolerate these ambiguities, for it drew power and efficiency from them. The freedmen who emerged from these processes, many of whom had once been skilled slaves, formed a new social layer, the liberti. They could marry, own property, build clienteles, and even ascend economically. Some became so influential that their descendants occupied political and military positions. Yet the stigma remained. Roman society never forgot that these men and women had once been property, and no matter how far they climbed, they carried their past like an eternal shadow. In short, skilled slaves were not exceptions. They were fundamental cogs in the Roman machine. They were the ones who managed, built, healed, educated, and enriched the empire from within, like the nerves of a body that never recognized them as a legitimate part. Their story is the story of intelligence placed at the service of oppression, and that is why, when we admire the genius of Rome, its works, its institutions, its culture, we must remember that much of what we call greatness was forged under chains, some of iron, others of gold, but all equally silent. Behind the pomp of Roman triumphs, the abundant harvests of the latifundia, the theatrical spectacles, and the public baths, there existed a daily, brutal, and essential scene, the slave market. Spread across the cities of the empire, from Rome to Antioch, from Carthage to Alexandria, these markets were the nerve center where the human body was reduced to a commodity, evaluated, negotiated, and transferred like an animal or a utilitarian object. The slave market was not a hidden underworld of Roman society. On the contrary, it was a central pillar of its economy, an institution as normalized as agricultural fairs or courts of law. In the city of Rome itself, areas such as the Forum Boarium, originally designated for cattle trade, also hosted human trafficking. There, in the very heart of the imperial capital, hundreds of newly arrived slaves, many from wars on the frontiers or from the provincial interiors, were displayed before the watchful eyes of buyers. Bound naked or nearly so, the men, women, and children stood on pedestals, turned their bodies on command, had their teeth inspected, their muscles prodded, their scars questioned. Hanging from their necks was a small board, the titulus, listing their qualities, origin, age, and any defects, such as illnesses, histories of escape, or behavioral problems. The commercial language was precise, cruel, and devoid of modesty. A strong, young, and obedient slave commanded a high price. A beautiful and submissive woman could be sold for even more, especially if she were a virgin or well-educated. Healthy children were sought by families wanting to raise servants from youth. Older slaves, those with marks of punishment, broken teeth, or poor health, were sold cheaply, often in lots as leftovers of commerce. Descriptions found in inscriptions and contracts show that every human aspect was turned into numbers. The soul was ignored. The value lay in function. Auctions were held outdoors or in enclosed spaces where merchants could present their products with greater control. In many cases, slaves were washed, oiled, and even made up to appear more presentable. Some specialized houses featured halls with curated lighting, pleasant scents, and skilled sellers who knew how to persuade clients with clever pitches. The sales technique was refined. They praised the slave's docility, intelligence, strength, or even fertility, if the buyer wished to increase his property through offspring. The price of slaves varied greatly depending on the market, the time period, and political conditions. During times of war and expansion, such as the Macedonian Wars or Caesar's campaigns in Gaul, the flood of prisoners drove prices down. In times of peace or crisis, when supply was scarce, prices rose, especially for skilled slaves. Sources such as Cicero and Suetonius report purchases reaching astronomical figures, particularly for musicians, Greek teachers, or highly sought-after physicians. Beyond direct purchases, there was also the slave rental system, especially in cities. Masters who did not wish to sell their servants but wanted to profit from their skills could rent them out for days, weeks, or months. A scribe, for example, could be hired to draft official documents. A craftsman might work on a public project for a limited period, receiving payment directly from the state, which was then passed to the slave's owner. This practice increased the economic circulation of slavery and revealed its total integration into the urban fabric. The slave market was governed by specific laws, such as the seller's responsibility for hidden defects. If a sold slave turned out to have mental illness, violent behavior, or a history of escape not previously disclosed, the buyer could demand a refund or return. This kind of legislation, documented in Roman law, did not aim to protect the slave, but to ensure trust and security in commercial transactions. Roman justice cared more about the smooth operation of the market than the fate of the lives being traded. Periodic fairs were also held in provincial regions, especially in busy ports and border towns. In these places, slaves were often displayed alongside cattle, grain, and textiles, reinforcing the perception that the human body was just another commodity in the Roman marketplace. In some provinces, children captured from raided villages were separated from their families, branded with hot irons, and transported over long distances to the commercial centers of the empire. The journey, often in deplorable conditions, claimed the lives of dozens before even reaching their destination. Most terrifying, however, was the normalization of this trade. To the average Roman citizen, the slave market was as ordinary as the vegetable market. There was no shock, no shame. Slaves were not people, they were property with a name, a price, and a use, and when they died, they were replaced as casually as a broken tool. This banality of existence reduced the horrors of slavery to a bookkeeping operation, perpetuating a system that, no matter how cruel, remained invisible to most. And so, in the markets, the squares, the forums, and the docks, Rome built its glory upon the public display of private pain. The forced smiles of the slaves, their empty eyes, their motionless bodies as they were inspected, told a story that official history chose not to narrate, but it existed. It supported temples, strengthened legions, and fed cities, and its echoes still resonate in the stones, in the ruins, in the fragmented records of a world that knew how to sell bodies, but refused to see their souls. More than any other civilization of antiquity, Rome transformed slavery not merely into an economic pillar, but into a consolidated legal institution, legitimized by laws, customs, and decrees that penetrated every sphere of civil life. In its obsession with order and law, the Romans built one of the most complex legal architectures in history, and at the heart of this structure pulsed a cruel paradox. An empire that prided itself on its justice but sustained its foundation through the legalized dehumanization of millions. In the Roman world, the slave was not a legal person, but a res, a thing, a piece of property. This condition was recorded unequivocally in the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled centuries later during the Byzantine period, though its roots were deeply embedded in the daily life of the Republic and the Empire. According to Roman law, a slave was a movable good, like a pack animal or a tool. His master had absolute power over him, the power to use, punish, sell, rent, gift, and even eliminate him, although over time, certain limitations were introduced more for economic and social stability than out of compassion. From the time of the old law of the 12 Tables, drafted around the 5th century before Christ, rules regarding debt servitude had already been established. These allowed a Roman citizen who defaulted on his debts to become a temporary slave of his creditor. This form of slavery, called nexum, was not eternal, but still set a grim legal precedent. A citizen could be temporarily stripped of his freedom and subjected to forced labor. Over time, especially following the social and political reforms at the end of the Republic, this form of servitude was abolished, not for ethical reasons but for political convenience and to appease the discontent of the urban plebs. Foreign slaves captured in war or bought at markets had no such partial protection. They could be punished physically without restriction, sold at any time, separated from their families, branded with hot irons, and even killed without their masters being held accountable, at least until the later imperial periods. Punishment was an essential part of the slavery structure. Penalties ranged from flogging and confinement to mutilation and public executions. Fear was used as a tool of control, and the legal apparatus served to institutionalize this logic. As centuries passed, certain regulations emerged, not to protect slaves themselves, but to prevent abuses that might lead to social instability. Emperor Augustus, for instance, implemented rules around slave manumission to control the excessive growth of the freed population. Later, Hadrian forbade the arbitrary execution of slaves by their masters without prior judgment, and Antoninus Pius introduced measures allowing slaves to report abuse to magistrates if they survived long enough to reach a court. These reforms, however progressive they may seem, never questioned the core of the system. The slave remained a thing, merely with more defined limits on their use. Roman criminal law reinforced this view. If a slave committed a crime, the punishment was harsher than that given to a citizen. If a master was murdered within his household, all the slaves in the residence could be legally executed, even if they had no connection to the crime. This principle, upheld in the name of prevention, turned the enslaved body into a collective of mutual responsibility, yet another internal mechanism of surveillance and control. The case of Lucius Pedanius Secundus, in the 1st century after Christ, where nearly 400 slaves were executed following the murder of their master, despite no evidence of conspiracy, is one of the most emblematic episodes of this legal cruelty. The concept of peculium, already mentioned earlier, was also an important legal construct. Although it allowed the slave to accumulate assets and, in theory, purchase his own freedom, the peculium was not the slave's property, but that of his master, who could revoke it at any time. The law allowed this arrangement as a means of encouraging productivity and loyalty, but never questioned the fundamental logic of ownership. What the slave owned was held only by concession, not by right. Manumission, the legal process of freeing a slave, could occur in several ways: by the master's will, through a will, by the slave purchasing their freedom, or as a reward for good service. But even freedmen bore legal stigmas. They remained forever tied to their former master, who became their patron. They could not hold high public office, and their children only became full citizens in the next generation. Freedom, therefore, came with an invisible chain. It was a new form of dependence disguised as emancipation. The empire also recorded public slaves, servii publici, who belonged to the state or municipalities. They worked in urban services, public works, building maintenance, and as assistants in magistracies. Although in less brutal conditions than private slaves, they were still legally classified as objects. Their existence underscored the systemic nature of slavery. It was not merely an economic or cultural practice, but a deeply embedded legal structure, meticulously regulated, woven into every aspect of Roman administration. The relationship between slavery and law in Rome is a dark mirror of what this civilization was capable of building. Its legal legacy, which would profoundly shape the Western world for millennia, was born stained with blood. The same empire that taught the world the principles of equity, jurisprudence, and citizenship sustained itself for centuries on the backs of human beings whom the law reduced to shadows. One cannot truly grasp the depth of Roman law without facing this abyss. A justice that prided itself on reason, yet rationalized oppression. If Roman slavery represented the complete denial of freedom, manumission was paradoxically the silent promise that kept many slaves obedient and hopeful. The possibility, however remote, of gaining autonomy and becoming a common freedman. However, this granted, negotiated, or purchased freedom always came wrapped in social limitations, legal bonds, and deep stigma. In the Roman world, becoming free did not necessarily mean becoming equal. The transition from slave to freedman was, in fact, the passage from explicit servitude to conditional freedom, surrounded by obligations, expectations, and invisible boundaries. Manumission, that is, the act of legally freeing a slave, could occur in various ways, the most common being direct manumission by the master's will, testamentary manumission after the master's death, purchase of freedom by the slave using his peculium, or informal manumission, often carried out publicly before witnesses. There was also manumission as a reward for services rendered to the state, as in the case of public slaves or enslaved soldiers who assisted in campaigns or critical tasks. However, the most regulated and secure method was the formal one, conducted before a magistrate or through official registration. This granting of freedom was legally complex. A slave freed by legal means and recognized by the state became a libertus, acquiring partial Roman citizenship. He could legally marry, sign contracts, accumulate wealth, and even own slaves. However, he remained subject to a series of obligations toward his former master, now transformed into a patron. This patron required the freedman to show loyalty, public respect, perform certain services, such as participating in religious or political rituals, and often pay a regular fee. The bond of dependence remained, but now under the veil of clientelism. This structure was reinforced by the tradition of patrician. The freedman was incorporated into the former master's clientele network and was expected to support him politically, honor him in ceremonies, and recognize him as an authority figure. Even having gained freedom, his identity was still shaped by his servile past. For this reason, many freedmen remained in their former masters' households or maintained economic and social relations with them, a practical continuity of servitude, albeit legally transformed. Access to manumission was unequal. Urban educated or skilled slaves, such as scribes, merchants, musicians, doctors, and tutors, had a greater chance of achieving freedom than rural slaves, miners, or quarry workers, whose labor was so harsh and dangerous that it rarely led to longevity or distinction. Moreover, manumission itself was often a strategic decision by the masters. Freeing a loyal and productive slave could be both a gesture of recognition and an investment in a future client or economic ally. In some cases, freedmen became procurators, managers, or even secret business partners of their former owners. The economic impact of freedmen was remarkable, without the physical limitations of slavery, but with the experience of forced labor and the ambition to rise socially. Many freedmen plunged eagerly into commerce, service provision, and asset management. Some became wealthy entrepreneurs, especially in maritime transport, hospitality, construction, and, ironically, the slave trade. These entrepreneurial freedmen, despite lingering prejudice, amassed fortunes and formed a kind of new plebeian elite, with access to goods, culture, and influence. The poet Horace, for example, was the son of a freedman. Trimalchio, a character in the famous satirical novel Satyricon by Petronius, caricatures the enriched freedman, vulgar, ostentatious, and eager to be accepted by the nobility, yet still bound to his servile roots. In reality, many freedmen experienced this tension between economic ascent and social exclusion. Despite partial citizenship, they could not hold magistracies, join the Senate, or occupy high-prestige political positions. This institutional barrier reinforced the divide between the freeborn tariqui ingenui and the ta freedmen. even though the children of freedmen, if born after manumission, were considered full citizens. On funerary epitaphs found throughout the empire, it is common to see freedmen proudly registered as former slaves, mentioning the name of their former master, their status as freedmen, and their accomplishments in free life. For many, freedom was the greatest possible achievement, even if imperfect, even if costly. It was a second chance, a partial dignity, a return to the humanity that had been denied them, and unlike slaves, whose names were lost to oblivion, freedmen could erect tombs, tell their stories, and leave marks in stone. The very existence of freedmen also cast shadows over the slave system. They were living proof that slaves were men and women capable of thinking, producing, creating, and leading, precisely what the official discourse denied. Their presence in markets, forums, and urban guilds was a constant reminder that the boundary between thing and person was thin, unstable, and arbitrary. For this reason, many aristocrats despised freedmen, even when wealthy, because they embodied a flaw in the dogma of natural superiority. Finally, the economy of the freedmen was also a tool of continuity. Many of them, upon becoming wealthy, bought their own slaves. They reproduced the system that had once oppressed them, now as masters. This cycle, though tragic, reveals the structural force of slavery in the Roman mindset. Even those who escaped it continued to see it as a natural part of the order of things. In Rome, freedom was not a rupture. It was a conditioned transition, a permission to exist on a new rung of the social ladder without ever forgetting who laid the first stone. In the beating heart of ancient Rome, where gods multiplied on public altars and domestic shrines, where sacrifices perfumed the air of the squares and processions intertwined with civic festivals, slaves walked among temples and rituals like human shadows, tolerated but never fully included in the sacred say. For free Romans, religion was an act of political, moral, and ancestral belonging. For the enslaved, it was an ambiguous space, at times shelter, at times boundary. Although they were allowed to worship gods, participate in rites, and make offerings, their presence in the spiritual realm was marked by inequality, symbolic exclusion, and constant surveillance. Roman religiosity was essentially civic and ritualistic, more concerned with the correct execution of formulas than within a faith. In this context, slaves, as permanent residents of households and cities, ended up absorbed into the religious routines of their masters. In patrician domination, for example, slaves participated in the family cults of the Sain, Lairs, and penates, protective deities of the home and family. They lit lamps, prepared ritual meals, tended the household altars, but always as assistants, never as protagonists. They were eyes that saw, hands that lit the flames, but mouths that did not pray for themselves. At the same time, many slaves, especially those from other regions of the empire, brought with them their own gods and beliefs. In moments of privacy or in small groups, they worshipped Eastern deities such as Isis, Cybele, Mithras, or African and Asian gods. This underground religiosity, often deemed superstitious by the elites, was in fact a mechanism of cultural preservation and symbolic resistance. Faith became a secret sanctuary where the slave could remember who they had been before slavery and perhaps dream of future freedom. Over time, the mystery cults, especially those of Mithras and Isis, began to attract not only slaves, but also soldiers, freedmen, and even members of the Roman middle class. These cults offered a more intimate spiritual experience, with promises of salvation, life after death, and ritual equality among initiates. For many slaves, these sects represented the only possibility of a religious experience in which their social condition was temporarily suspended. In the Mithraeus, sacred caves dedicated to Mithras, the initiate was treated as an equal, even if outside those walls they remained the property of another. Still, the inclusion of slaves in public religiosity was carefully controlled. During festivals such as the Kaki Saturnalia, held in December, social roles were symbolically inverted. Slaves could sit at the table with their masters, wear free men's clothing, play and laugh. But all of this was allowed for just a few days in a social theater that, rather than subversion, served to reinforce the order. By permitting slaves to momentarily experience a festive freedom, masters reminded everyone that normalcy, servitude, would soon return. It was a calculated concession, like a breath before plunging back into the depths. From a legal standpoint, slaves could not hold official religious positions, such as priests, sacerdotes, or flamines, priests of the main cults. Nor could they offer sacrifices on behalf of the city, lead public processions, or consecrate sacred spaces. In many cases, they were not even allowed to enter the major temples. Religion, as an expression of Roman order, was a mirror of society. It reflected with cruel clarity who was a citizen and who was merely property. With the arrival of Christianity, the relationship between slaves and religion began to change. In the first centuries after Christ, Christian communities offered a radical spiritual message. In Christ, there is neither slave nor free, said Paul's epistle to the Galatians. This message of equality before God, though it did not immediately overthrow the Roman slave structure, introduced a subversive ferment. In the catacombs, slaves and masters were buried side by side. In secret worship, they shared bread and wine. For the first time, faith began to offer not only comfort but also the embryo of spiritual dignity. However, even in early Christianity, the earthly liberation of slaves was not a priority. Salvation was promised in the afterlife, not in the present. Church leaders, including figures like Augustine of Hippos and Gregory the Great, did not directly condemn slavery, but taught that masters should treat their slaves kindly and that slaves should obey humbly as proof of their faith. Religion thus transformed slavery from a legal and economic structure into a theological narrative. To be a slave was also, in a sense, a path to sanctification. Despite this, archaeological records reveal that many Christian slaves were deeply devout. Funerary inscriptions, graffiti, and small devotional objects found in places such as the catacombs of St. Calixtus and Domitilla in Rome show prayers written by servants, references to martyrdoms, and vows of hope in eternal life. In this new spiritual imagination, suffering gained meaning. The oppressed body was no longer just a machine, it was a vessel of grace. Pain found its voice. Thus, Roman slaves traversed different spiritual territories, excluded from official rituals, tolerated in household cults, welcomed in mystery rites, and evangelized by Christians. In each of these spaces, faith served at times as comfort, at times as an instrument of power, and at times as silent resistance. Religion for them was the place where the soul sought to escape the chains of the body, where hope disguised itself as prayer, where even without an altar of their own, they dared to dream of a world where they would be seen not as property, but as people, before gods and before men. Throughout the vast and brutal history of slavery in Rome, marked by silent submission and the normalization of violence, there were moments when the muffled cries of the oppressed broke through the chains of fear and set the empire ablaze with desperate fury. These moments were rare, bloody, and often crushed before they could fully mature, but they were real. Among all the uprisings recorded in the annals of Roman power, none was as striking, as feared, or as symbolic as the revolt led by a man who would become, against all odds, an eternal symbol of resistance to slavery, Spartacus. Originally from Thrace, Spartacus was, according to sources like Plutarch and Appian, a former soldier who was captured, enslaved, and sent to be trained as a gladiator at the school of Capua in southern Italy. There, among iron chains, screams, and the blood spilled in the arenas, he found not only the hell of submission, but also the spark of rebellion. In 73 years before Christ, he and around 70 other gladiators broke through the gates of the school, armed themselves with kitchen utensils and improvised weapons, and escaped to the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. Thus began what would become known as the Third Servile War, the largest slave uprising in the history of Rome. What started as an escape quickly turned into a full-scale rebellion. Rural slaves from nearby estates, impoverished peasants, and even army deserters began to join Spartacus. Within months, the group had swelled to over 40,000 men. Unlike other isolated revolts that were crushed within days, this one gained structure, organization, and a clear purpose. Spartacus was not just an improvised military leader. He was charismatic, strategic, and seemed driven by something deeper than vengeance, a belief that it was possible to break the cycle of servitude, to destroy the foundations of the system that held them captive, and to achieve freedom, not just for himself but for all. For 2 years, Republican Rome, then immersed in political and military turmoil, was repeatedly humiliated by an army of former slaves. The rebels defeated official troops, looted towns, freed captives, and even managed to control entire regions of Italy. Alarmed, the Senate sent successive legions against Spartacus, all of which were defeated. The revolt reached epic proportions. Fear spread among the nobility. In every senatorial home, in every rural domus, eyes turned in terror toward their own slaves, fearing that the example of Spartacus would ignite an uncontrollable flame. Despite the victories, the rebels' fate remained uncertain. Spartacus, according to records, wished to cross the Alps and allow his companions to return to their native lands. But many of his followers, intoxicated by success and the spoils of war, refused. The rebel army became divided. Time passed. Rome reorganized. And finally, in 71 years before Christ, the Senate handed military command to the ambitious and ruthless Marcus Licinius Crassus. With iron discipline and calculated brutality, he launched an unrelenting campaign against the insurgent slaves. He built trenches, blockades, and cut off supply routes, slowly but surely encircling Spartacus. The final battle took place in the region of Lucania. The rebel army, cornered, fought with ferocity but was massacred. Spartacus, according to Appian, fell in combat. His body was never identified, perhaps as a symbol of the eternity of his cause. The survivors were hunted down, executed or crucified. More than 6,000 slaves were nailed alive along the Appian Way, the road that connected Rome to Capua. Each cross, each body exposed to the sun and to mockery, was a warning. This is the fate of those who dare challenge the system. But the blood spilled was not in vain. The revolt of Spartacus deeply scarred Roman memory. It was a trauma, a wound that never healed. No matter how much Rome tried to erase him from the records, the name of Spartacus echoed among captives, among gladiators, among the downtrodden. He became a living legend, a breath of hope, a symbol that power was not invincible. Even among free Romans, there were those who admired his courage. Cicero, although critical, acknowledged the impact of the uprising. Centuries later, Christian and Enlightenment thinkers would reclaim his figure as a true symbol of oppressed freedom. It is important to remember that other revolts both preceded and followed Spartacus. The First Servile War, which occurred in Sicily in 135 years before Christ, and the Second in 104 years before Christ, also mobilized tens of thousands of slaves, revealing that the system was sustained not only by force, but by fear of its collapse. Yet none of these insurrections had the symbolic and emotional impact of the Thracian revolt. Spartacus did not merely fight, he inspired. He did not merely flee, he led. And even in defeat, he was never forgotten. The resistance of slaves in Rome took many forms. It lived in the body that endured the unbearable, in the silent escape that defied control, in the secret cults that preserved identities, in the daily acts of sabotage, and of course in great rebellions like that of Spartacus. Oppression was never absolute. There was always a spark, a gesture, a look that said, "I am still human." And this humanity, denied by the system, is what made the slave revolts not just military events, but acts of existential affirmation. As the Roman Empire stretched its borders beyond the hills of Latium and the valleys of the Tiber, reaching into African deserts, Germanic forests, Balkan mountains, and Mediterranean islands, the institution of slavery not only expanded, it transformed, assuming diverse forms depending on the environment, local culture, and the economic demands of each province. Slavery in Rome was centralized in concept, but plural in execution. And it is in this mosaic of practices and realities that we find one of the most complex and least uniform dimensions of the Roman slave system. In regions such as Sicily, for example, rural slavery reached massive and brutal proportions. With its vast tracts of fertile land and ideal climate for grain cultivation, the island became a true laboratory for intensive agricultural production based on servile labor. Thousands of slaves, mostly captured during Eastern wars, were employed under subhuman conditions on large estate plantations. It was there that two of the largest slave revolts of the Republican period broke out, in 135 years before Christ and 104 years before Christ. a reflection of the unsustainable concentration of power, land, and suffering. In the eastern provinces, such as Syria, Egypt, and Asia Minor, slavery took on more urban and bureaucratic forms. Hellenistic cities like Alexandria, Antioch, and Ephesus had long traditions of servitude predating Roman rule. In these regions, many slaves worked as scribes, teachers, merchants, or interpreters. Some even held administrative positions in palaces or temples, especially under the patronage of local elites who cooperated with imperial authority. Slavery there was deeply connected to Greek and Egyptian culture, where knowledge and skill afforded the enslaved a certain level of prestige, even if not freedom. In Gaul and Hispania, newly conquered during the 2nd and 1st centuries before Christ, slavery was established on the foundations of war and agriculture. Prisoners from Celtic and Iberian tribes were sent to work in silver, lead, and copper mines, or sold to agricultural estates that supplied the Roman army. In the gold mines of Asturias and Galicia, slave labor was intensive, dangerous, and exhausting, with reports of mass deaths and degrading living conditions. The Romanization of these regions thus involved not only the imposition of laws and language, but also the implementation of an economy based on servile exploitation. In North Africa, particularly in Carthage and Roman Egypt, slaves served in various spheres of society. In Carthage, rebuilt as a Roman colony after its destruction, slaves worked on olive plantations in the extraction of resins and dyes, and as domestic servants in Roman households. In Egypt, which was directly controlled by the emperor as his personal property, the agrarian structure was highly developed and managed through large estates, overseen by bureaucrats. There, many laborers were bound to the state, working as farmers on imperial lands, a model closer to administrative servitude than classical slavery. In the Danubian and Balkan provinces, marked by ongoing conflicts and unstable frontiers, slavery was concentrated in military zones and fortifications. Slaves were used in the construction of roads, bridges, and camps. The constant presence of legions turned these regions into military production zones, where newly captured prisoners fed a logistical chain essential to the empire's expansion. In such regions, slavery was functional, driven by military necessity, another cog in the machinery of war. On the Mediterranean islands beyond, such as Crete, Rhodes, and Cyprus, slavery blended domestic, agricultural, and commercial functions. With bustling ports, these islands served as hubs for goods and for people. Slave markets in these areas were well known, especially for the sale of women and children destined for domestic service or prostitution. Maritime trade, vital to the imperial economy, was operated, maintained, and sustained in part by enslaved hands that loaded, unloaded, navigated, and maintained ships. It is important to emphasize that although Roman law was generally applied throughout the empire, the local implementation of slavery was influenced by each region's pre-Roman culture, the resistance of local populations, and the needs of the moment. Some governors were more severe, others more moderate. Some provincial elites adopted the Roman model fully. Others adapted it to the practices of their own ancestors. Thus, slavery mirrored Roman flexibility. The law unified, but practice diversified. Throughout the empire, however, the slave's condition was universally marked by the absence of freedom. Their value depended on their role, location, and how much they could be exploited. But their legal status remained unchanged. Property, not person. The regional diversity of slavery did not alter its essence, only its methods of implementation. And amid so many geographies, accents, functions, and destinies, one thing was shared: silence. A silence imposed, cultivated, and feared by masters. A silence that crossed oceans and deserts, ruins and walls. A silence that upheld the empire, but that, as we have seen in certain provinces, dared to scream. In the 3rd century after Christ, the Roman Empire plunged into one of the most turbulent periods of its existence. Civil wars, barbarian invasions, devastating epidemics, monetary collapse, and political instability shook the foundations that had supported Rome for centuries. It was a time of fleeting emperors, disloyal legions, and crumbling frontiers. Yet while past historians focused on the names of generals and the battles fought, a silent and transformative phenomenon was taking place in the countryside, in cities, and in the empire's economic relations. The beginning of the decline of the traditional slave system and the gradual emergence of new forms of compulsory labor that would shape the medieval world. During the golden centuries of slavery, Rome had ensured a constant flow of captive labor thanks to its military victories. Every successful war produced thousands of prisoners who were quickly absorbed into the internal market, fueling farms, mines, workshops, and aristocratic households. But as the pace of conquest slowed and pressures increased along the frontiers, that supply began to dwindle. Wars were no longer a reliable source of slaves, and capturing Germanic or Persian peoples in large numbers was becoming increasingly difficult. The system, once self-renewing, began to fail. Moreover, cities were in crisis. The devaluation of currency, triggered by the reduction of silver content in the denarius, led to runaway inflation. Large landowners began to retreat from urban activities, seeking security and self-sufficiency on their rural estates. The costs of maintaining slaves, which included food, clothing, shelter, surveillance, and upkeep, began to be seen as excessive. Many landowners opted to replace slaves with impoverished free workers who offered their labor in exchange for shelter, land to cultivate, and some form of protection. This marked the beginning of a new social class, the colony. The colony were free men, but their freedom was fragile and increasingly hollow. Living on land they did not own, they cultivated small plots and paid tribute to the landowner, usually in agricultural goods or services. They were not bought or sold like slaves, but they were bound to the land, and over time their condition became hereditary. They could no longer leave the property without permission or transfer their rights to others. The landowner exercised over them a level of control increasingly similar to that which had once been held over slaves, though now disguised in contractual and voluntary terms. Meanwhile, the Roman state tried to restructure its tax base, requiring large estate owners to guarantee production and the payment of taxes, even obliging them to maintain a stable workforce on their land. To prevent tax evasion, imperial authorities began to fix peasants to the land, institutionalizing practices which, although different from traditional slavery, maintained a form of legalized servitude. It is in this moment that we see the roots of medieval serfdom germinating in the soil of a collapsing empire. Even slaves themselves began to transform within this new landscape. Many landowners started to grant small parcels of land to their slaves, with the condition that they cultivate it and hand over part of the harvest to the dominus. In return, the landowners ceased to be fully responsible for the upkeep of their captives. This practice, though seemingly benevolent, was driven by economic and administrative motives. The slave became more productive, more committed, and less costly. This gradual shift from domestic slavery to rural servitude represented in practice a reconfiguration of slavery, not its abolition. The crises also severely impacted urban centers, which gradually emptied. Workshops closed, markets dwindled, and urban slaves, once numerous, became a burdensome liability. Many were freed or abandoned to their fate, swelling the ranks of the destitute who wandered the roads, seeking refuge in churches, villages, and rural estates. Society began to reorganize, no longer around cities, but around relationships of dependence between landowners and subordinate workers, whether they were former slaves, colony, or landless peasants. Little by little, the Western Roman Empire ceased to be a civilization of markets, armies, and aqueducts, and became a world of fiefs, fortresses, and churches. Slavery, though still present, was no longer the central gear of the economy. It was being replaced by subtler yet equally oppressive structures. Freedom became a relative notion. The man who was no longer sold as property was now tied to the land, to taxes, to fear. Christianity, which by this time had already become the official religion, also contributed to this transition. Although the Church did not directly condemn slavery, it encouraged the liberation of captives as acts of charity and redemption. The manumission of slaves became common in wills, religious ceremonies, and gestures of piety. As a result, the freed population grew, and many of these former slaves were absorbed into the new forms of rural servitude. Christian doctrine did not abolish the dominion of one man over another, but it helped soften its appearance and spiritualize it, converting the master into a patron and the servant into a protected soul. The crisis of the 3rd century after Christ did not destroy Roman slavery, but it pushed it into a historical metamorphosis, and from that metamorphosis was born feudal Europe, with its castles, serfs, tithes, and hierarchies. The transition from slave to serf did not mark the end of exploitation, but rather the changing of the mask that oppression wore. Rome, even in decline, continued shaping the future, no longer with swords and shackles, but with contracts and hereditary bonds. With the rise of Christianity in the Roman world, slavery found a new language through which to survive. The faith that had emerged among the marginalized and persecuted, and that proclaimed the equality of all men before God, became the official religion of the empire at the very moment when slavery was undergoing one of the most transformative phases of its history. And it is in this convergence, both spiritual and pragmatic, that we perceive one of the great contradictions of early Christianity. While it preached universal brotherhood, it silently legitimized servitude as part of the natural order of things. In the texts of the New Testament, we find signs of this ambiguity. The Apostle Paul, one of the central voices of the new faith, does not directly condemn slavery. In his letters to Christian communities, he exhorts slaves to obey their masters with fear and trembling in the sincerity of your hearts as to Christ, Ephesians 6:5, and advises masters to treat their servants justly, reminding them that both have the same master in heaven. These words, though they may reflect an attempt to humanize the relationship between master and slave, ultimately reaffirm the structure of domination, now cloaked in spiritual language. Christian teaching, therefore, was not abolitionist. It operated in the moral realm, not the legal one. What mattered to the new religion was the salvation of the soul, not the liberation of the body. The slave was seen as a human being endowed with spiritual dignity and capable of reaching heaven, but his earthly condition of servitude was accepted as part of God's divine plan, as a cross to bear, a path to sanctification. Many priests and bishops were, in fact, slaveholders, and although they encouraged good practices, such as compassionate treatment or voluntary manumission, they did not advocate for the abolition of the system that sustained the empire's economy and social order. With Emperor Constantine's conversion to Christianity in the early 4th century after Christ, and especially after the Edict of Thessalonica, which made Christianity the official religion of the empire in 380, the relationship between faith and slavery became even more institutionalized. The church began to accumulate land, wealth, and power. Many of its monasteries and institutions employed slave labor, just like secular estates. The justification was simple. If society was ordered by God, and each person occupied the place destined for them, then slavery was not only tolerated, but also theologically defensible. Even so, it is important to recognize that Christianity also opened cracks in the official discourse of oppression. The idea that all men were brothers in Christ, that the final judgment would make no distinction between master and slave, and that charity was a sacred duty, created both symbolic and practical spaces for acts of mercy and ethical resistance. Manumission as a demonstration of faith became common. Bishops freed servants on holy days. Wills included clauses of emancipation as a guarantee of eternal salvation. Faith thus acted as a catalyst for small individual transformations, even if the system as a whole remained intact. Christianity also offered something that Roman civic religion had never provided to slaves, a true spiritual place of belonging. In Christian communities, slaves could pray, receive communion, be baptized, and even become spiritual leaders, especially in the more remote regions of the empire, where social structures were more fluid. During times of persecution, many slaves became martyrs, bearing witness with their own blood to their fidelity to the new faith. In the tombs of the catacombs, we find humble inscriptions, carved by calloused hands, asking for divine intercession, celebrating faith, affirming an identity that had long been denied. With the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the transition into the medieval world, the Church began to assume a quasi-governmental role in many regions. And in this new scenario, slavery gave way to forms of rural servitude that inherited many of its features, though under new names and structures. The Church did not oppose servitude, it absorbed, regulated, and spiritualized it. The serf was no longer a thing, but he remained bound to the land, the Lord, the tithe, and original sin. Domination was now sacralized, as if inequality among men were part of the harmony of the Christian universe. Still, the message of freedom inscribed in the roots of the gospel never fully disappeared. In every Christian community, every monk, every martyr, there was a seed of human dignity that, centuries later, would blossom into abolitionist discourses, emancipation movements, and doctrines of equality. Christianity's contradiction regarding slavery is therefore a mirror of the tensions that ran through all of Western civilization, between faith and power, between justice and tradition, between divine ideals and human reality. In the end, what Christianity offered to slaves was not abolition, but a name before God, a soul, a place in heaven, a promise of redemption that escaped the legal and economic logic of the Roman world. For many, that was enough to endure. For others, it was not. But it marked the beginning of a slow and silent transformation, not of slavery itself, but of the way humanity finally began to see the enslaved. At first glance, Roman slavery may appear to be a phenomenon confined to the past, an institution that ended with the fall of the empire and dissolved into the mists of the Middle Ages. But this is a comforting illusion. The historical truth is deeper, more complex, and at times disconcerting. Roman slavery did not disappear. It transformed. Its legal, economic, social, and symbolic foundations penetrated the fabric of European civilization, giving rise to new forms of domination, servitude, and inequality that would survive for centuries under different names, dressed in new garments, but rooted in the same logic of bodily exploitation and the denial of freedom. With the collapse of the Western Roman Empire in 476 after Christ, centralized political structures crumbled, armies disbanded, cities fell into decay, and the economic infrastructure that had supported vast slave markets disintegrated. Barbarian invasions, urban exodus, and commercial retraction fragmented the Roman world into a multitude of fiefs, fortified villages, and autonomous estates. Yet the social relations of dependence, the idea that one class serves and another commands, remained present, a lingering echo of the ancient world. In this new context emerged feudal serfdom, a direct heir to Roman practices. Serfs were no longer legally considered things as slaves had been, but their freedom was severely limited. Tied to the land without the right to move, without political autonomy, without full property rights, they lived under the absolute control of the feudal lord, to whom they owed taxes, labor, and loyalty. The lord, in turn, wielded legal, military, and religious authority over the serfs, a combination of powers that in many ways recalled the role of the ancient Roman dominus. The vocabulary had changed, the chains were different, but the principle of one class dominating another remained intact. The transition from slavery to serfdom was neither abrupt nor uniform. In many regions of the former empire, especially in North Africa and Eastern Europe, slavery formally persisted well beyond the fall of Rome. In the East, under the rule of the Byzantine Empire, slave markets remained active for centuries. In the Iberian Peninsula, under Visigothic influence, slavery was gradually replaced by colonate contracts, hybrid forms that combined agricultural servitude with legal remnants of Roman slavery. The same occurred in Gaul, where the Franks absorbed the Roman landholding system and adapted it to the new Germanic order. More than just an economic practice, Roman slavery left behind a cultural and mental legacy. Throughout the Middle Ages and even into the modern age, scholars, jurists, and theologians who reflected on social relations leaned on the texts of Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled in the 6th century after Christ, under Emperor Justinian, would be rediscovered in medieval universities and used as the basis for legislation across Europe. And in it, slavery was not only tolerated, it was codified with clarity, logic, and systematization. Thus, even where formal slavery no longer existed, the notion that it was legitimate for some men to be the property of others continued to echo through the halls of law. Another important aspect is the role of the church in this process. As we have seen, Christianity absorbed Roman slavery and spiritualized it. Over time, this attitude extended to feudal servitude, which came to be seen as part of the divine plan. Lords were regarded as shepherds of their lands and the souls under their care. Serfs, in turn, were expected to accept their position with humility as a path to redemption. This view endured for centuries, blocking the emergence of libertarian or egalitarian ideologies. The post-Roman world inherited not only the economic practices of slavery, but also its justificatory discourses. It was only from the 14th and 15th centuries after Christ, with the urban, commercial and intellectual rebirth of Europe, that we begin to see more consistent challenges to the ideas of servitude and slavery. But, ironically, it was during this same period that the transatlantic slave trade began to be organized, now based on colonial exploitation and scientific racism. The Portuguese and Spanish ships crossing the Atlantic did not carry only men in shackles. They also carried the legal, economic and philosophical memory of Rome. Modern slavery did not emerge from nothing. It was a reinvention and a continuation of Roman slavery, adapted to new times. The word slave in various European languages, slave in English, esclave in French, sclavo in Italian, derives from slaves, the peoples of Eastern Europe who were frequently captured and sold as slaves in the medieval world. This reveals not only the persistence of the practice, but also how deeply it became culturally embedded. An entire people's name became synonymous with servitude, a testament to the lasting impact of Roman slavery on the collective consciousness of the West. In the end, the legacy of Roman slavery cannot be measured solely by the centuries it lasted within the borders of the empire. It must be evaluated by how its ideas, structures and justifications traveled through time, infiltrating the new forms of domination that would arise after Rome. It was Rome that taught the West how to turn exploitation into legal norm, how to organize oppression with juridical rationality, how to maintain the silence of the oppressed with promises of order and progress. And that lesson passed down through the centuries still reverberates, silent yet present in the underground currents of history. In the vast and intricate fabric of the Roman economy, where silver-minted coins circulated through bustling marketplaces, where ships crossed the Mediterranean laden with grain, wine and marble, there was one silent, vital and essential commodity: the enslaved human being. Slavery, more than a social institution, was a central economic machine, upon which much of the empire's wealth, productivity and very logic of operation rested. The slave was not merely labor, he was a financial asset, productive capital, and a strategic piece in Rome's political and commercial game. From a strictly accounting perspective, each slave had a value that varied according to age, health, skills, origin, and function. A young, strong slave trained for agricultural labor might cost the equivalent of dozens of denarii. An educated urban slave, such as an accountant, scribe, or physician, could be worth hundreds. Some exceptional individuals, such as Greek pedagogues, talented musicians, or slaves trained in law and administration, reached prices comparable to entire houses or commercial vessels. In inheritance records and private estates, slaves appeared as valued assets, listed by utility and liquidity. Beyond acquisition cost, the slave generated a direct income. On farms, their labor multiplied the production of grains, wine, and olive oil. In mines, they extracted metals that fueled monetary industries and elite luxuries. In cities, they provided services, ran workshops, cooked, educated, and healed. Each day of a slave's labor was a fraction of profit for the dominus. And unlike a free worker, the slave required no salary, could not refuse orders, and could not be absent without punishment. Their output belonged entirely to the master, who decided how, where, and when to exploit them. This logic transformed the slave into a kind of human production machine, a biological tool which, if well fed and supervised, yielded constant returns. Like any economic good, the slave required investment, minimal food, basic clothing, supervision, and a place to sleep. But the return, when properly managed, surpassed many other forms of capital. Not by chance, large Roman estate owners maintained actual registries of their slaves, with records of productivity, behavior, illness, and punishments, living spreadsheets of the servile economy. The slave market, in turn, was a highly dynamic sector. Specialized traders roamed the provinces in search of new captives, attended auctions, offered guarantees, and even financed purchases with terms and interest. The logic of supply and demand operated with precision. During successful military campaigns, supply rose and prices dropped. In times of peace or demographic crisis, values climbed, and masters began to protect their assets more carefully. Slavery was not just an exercise of power, it was a highly profitable business. driven by calculation and expected return. In many cases, slaves themselves generated additional profit through the peculium, a kind of savings fund that some urban slaves received to manage small commercial activities. With part of their profits, they paid a commission to their master. This practice turned the slave into a subordinate entrepreneur, increasing their economic utility and incentivizing productivity. And although in theory the peculium could be used to purchase freedom, in practice it was more often a tool for intensified labor and reinforced loyalty to the master. Even the reproduction of slaves was viewed through a financial lens. Female slaves who became pregnant by other household slaves produced children born into servitude, which meant patrimonial growth without acquisition cost. Some patrician families maintained reproductive clusters on their estates, with the clear goal of producing new slaves for internal use or sale. These practices closely resembled animal breeding, with the difference that, in this case, they were human beings valued for their docility, strength, and profit-generating capacity. In agricultural treatises by authors such as Varro, Cato the Elder, and Guido Columella, we find meticulous descriptions of how to maximize the efficiency of slave labor, from ideal diets to maintain physical strength, to the arrangement of sleeping quarters to prevent escape and conspiracy. Everything was calculated for productivity. Cruelty was not merely permitted, it was planned, rationalized, and systematized as part of estate management. Rebellious slaves were punished exemplarily, not just out of vengeance, but to preserve the economic value of the rest. The Roman state also profited from slavery. Taxes on slave sales, manumission fees, marketplace tariffs, and revenues from public slaves contributed to the imperial budget. Moreover, the use of slaves in public works, urban maintenance, and even bureaucratic assistance made administration cheaper and more efficient. The imperial economy, though diverse, was deeply rooted in servile exploitation, and any analysis of its stability or growth must acknowledge that. Over time, the system began to wear down. The scarcity of new conquests reduced the flow of captives. The cost of maintaining large masses of slaves became burdensome. The rise of colonate contracts and rural servitude hinted at new forms of value extraction, less visibly violent, but equally oppressive. Yet the economic legacy of Roman slavery remained. It taught the Western world how to turn people into numbers, bodies into capital, labor into property. And even after the formal end of the empire, those lessons were not lost. They traversed centuries, reappearing in new trade routes, colonial plantations, tropical sugar mills, and slave ships. The slavery that had once sustained Rome's greatness would continue to haunt human history with its ruthless logic, a logic that saw the human being not as an end in itself, but as a means of profit, control, and power. As we contemplate the grandeur of the Roman Empire, its triumphal arches, its eternal roads, its majestic forums, its libraries and theaters, we are inevitably led into a narrative of glory, civilization, and progress. But behind those marble columns and immortal statues lies a truth that must not be forgotten. Rome was built by chained hands. The empire that illuminated the ancient world with its engineering, laws, and language sustained that light at the cost of extinguishing the freedom of millions. And in this brutal paradox rests the deepest ethical dilemma of antiquity, the coexistence of brilliance and inhumanity. Roman slavery was not an accident nor a historical aberration. It was a systematic choice, a calculated mechanism, a pillar rationalized by jurists, philosophers, and politicians. It was defended as natural, desirable, and even necessary. Slaves themselves, often deprived of education and autonomy, internalized that destiny as inevitable. The machinery of the empire was so efficient that it even transformed pain into silence, the whip into routine, servitude into scenery. And yet, in every legal record, every mosaic, every funerary inscription mentioning the name of a slave, there was a spark of humanity that resisted. There were people who loved, who dreamed, who created, who resisted, who were more than the system allowed itself to see. These forgotten voices, these lives left unrecorded by official history, are today the protagonists of our retrospective gaze. Because to understand slaveholding Rome is not only to understand the past, it is to confront the mirrors that this past still holds before us. The debate about ethics, freedom, and power that ran through Roman philosophy, from Cicero to Seneca, from Marcus Aurelius to Epictetus, rarely included the slave as a full subject. Morality was reserved for the citizen, virtue for the free, reason for the dominator. Few questioned whether slavery itself was unjust. Most merely discussed how to make it more efficient, less cruel, more stable. This absence of deep ethical questioning reveals how the normalization of inequality can infiltrate even the most elevated minds of an era. When oppression becomes banal, it vanishes from awareness. And yet, there were ruptures, there were voices. Spartacus was not merely a rebel, he was a reminder that the system was fragile. The Christian martyrs were not only victims of persecution, they were signs that the human soul cannot be completely tamed. The freedmen who built fortunes and left their marks on tombstones and buildings were more than exceptions. They were testimonies that freedom is an indomitable force, even when surrounded by chains. Over time, Roman slavery disappeared as a dominant structure, but its legacy endured in legal codes, social customs, economic frameworks, and mindsets. And even today, in times of proclaimed freedom, the shadows of that history still reach us, in persistent inequalities, in new forms of exploitation, in the invisible boundaries between power and servitude. Therefore, studying the role of slaves in the Roman economy is not merely a historical exercise, it is an act of remembrance, and more than that, it is an act of belated justice. To remember the millions who lived and died without leaving a trace is not only to give them a place in history, it is to recognize that progress without ethics is not civilization, but domination disguised, that wealth without compassion is not virtue, but conquest, that all greatness built upon pain must be told in all its colors, even the darkest ones. And thus, as we conclude this journey through one of the most hidden and essential aspects of the Roman world, we do not look to the generals or senators, but to those who silently sustained the machinery of the empire. For it is in the anonymous faces, in the wounded hands, and in the erased stories that the true history of Rome resides, the history of those who, even enslaved, were indispensable, irreplaceable, and above all, human.